Hey, how's it going, guys? Hope you guys are staying safe and healthy. So today I'm going to be reviewing The Amazing Spider-Man by David Michelinie and Todd McFarlane. This was a spectacular read, and I am super excited to get to review this. Shout out to my boy Alex for selling this copy to me. Really appreciate it, man. In fact, shout out to basically my entire bottom shelf there with Teen Titans and the Spider-Man Omnis. Thank you very much, man. Appreciate it. So let's get into this. Alright, so first things first, let's look at the actual sleeve and cover. So as you can see, we've got Spider-Man swinging up here. I honestly love this art style. When I think of Spider-Man, this is what I see. So this was just really cool getting to experience that. Got this here. We got, oh, what's that? Is that Venom? But one thing you might notice is his teeth. I don't know if it'll focus. It will. His teeth are like normal human teeth. So when he first appeared, he actually had normal, like, just, solid denture-looking teeth. And then on the back, of course, we've got the pricing, and we've got all the issues it contains. So for those who can't see too well, 100 US or 127 Canadian plus tax, of course. It collects The Amazing Spider-Man, number 296 through 329, and material from Spectacular Spider-Man Annual 10. Alright, so let's read the back. For the first time, more than 100 pages of pivotal Spidey material by groundbreaking creators David Michelinie and Todd McFarlane are collected under one cover. Michelinie and McFarlane made Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson a hip, happening couple in the middle of Manhattan. They amped up the action as old-school villains such as Dr. Octopus, Sandman, the Lizard, and the Green Goblin came calling. And most important, they introduced a powerful and recurring nemesis in Eddie Brock, the villainous Venom. So yes, this is the story that introduced Venom himself, probably one of my favorite villains in Spider-Man. But yeah, that is the sleeve. Now, what does the actual hardcover look like? Good question. Well, front's basically the same, except it doesn't have the Amazing Spider-Man on the top. Same with the spine. The back's got the black suit, or alien suit Spider-Man. Pretty cool. So, talking a little bit about the format here. You might notice that this has a curved spine. So, I'm trying to line this up here. Basically what that means is that, well, first of all, I believe this is a sewn binding. Yep. And it just means it reads so much easier. It opens up nice. You get a beautiful eye. And, yeah, literally no gutter loss. There wasn't a single page that I read where I'm like, oh, man, I wish I could see something. No, it's all in there. I had zero gutter loss, and I was super happy about that. So, ultimately, excellent format. Omni's my favorite format, and just knowing that there's a beautiful, beautifully made version like this makes me super duper happy. Alright, so let's move on looking at some of the art. So like I said, this is like the Spider-Man that I look at and I'm like, yeah, that's Spider-Man. Like, I see this art and I recognize it so clearly. And I wish that certain, stories kind of still kept this art style. I know some people nowadays might say it's out of date. There's less color detail, there's less shading. Nowadays, there's just so much content or so much like more detail in the art. But to me, I feel like this is like a perfect representation of what the Spider-Man universe is. And I think it's a real shame that we don't get to see this kind of art style as much anymore with Spider-Man, especially now that we've got different artists and different authors. But one thing that really struck like a tone for me, or I don't even know what the proper terminology is, but one thing that really stood out to me was like the parallels between this and the 1994 animated series. Now, obviously, this run came out before the 1994 animated series, so I mean it's safe to assume that the animated series pulled inspiration from this. But my childhood, I grew up watching this series. I wasn't a big comic person. I loved cartoons, and watching the Spider-Man animated series was like my introduction to Spider-Man. And then of course, like I watched the Sam Raimi movies and all that stuff. So, like, to me, like, this type of Spider-Man is the Spider-Man that I know and love. Like before I read this Omni, I never really understood why some people might not like necessarily Tom Holland's Spider-Man. I think it's an amazing Spider-Man, even after reading this Omni. But one thing I will say is that this Spider-Man, I understand the complaints a little bit now in terms of some people saying He's not that, teenage quippy boy that we know. He's more of a tech nerd. And stuff like that. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that Spider-Man is without a doubt a tech nerd. Throughout this entire story, he is constantly working on upgrades for, his web shooters, making them more versatile, changing them from metal to plastic so they won't set off metal detectors, stuff like that. Like, that's absolutely on point, and I'm really happy to see that reflected in the MCU. But one thing I think it's missing is, like, the quippiness, him talking to himself, like, just the small things. And, like, you can really tell that both the 1994 and this run have that in common, in the sense that Spider-Man is that classic person who always just kind of talks to himself and says stuff that's kind of like, oh yeah, it's kind of funny. I don't really know how to describe it other than saying quippy. And like, like stuff that he says when he swings in on people, like puns almost. He's basically like a certified dad superhero, and I just love that. It was really interesting to see Mary Jane as like his wife, because I think that to me is new a little bit. I mean, I knew that was like a thing in the comics. I'd never experienced it before, so that was new to me in general. But yeah, no, ultimately, I really loved this run. Some things that I liked, I loved getting to see some of the classic villains. Scorpion. We got to see. I wish we could have seen Vulture. I love Vulture. Super cool guy. But we got to see, the Lizard, Chameleon, Green Goblin, Hobgoblin. Who else? We got to see Red Skull. We got to see a lot of people, actually. We saw Loki for a little bit, but that was more of like a cameo, if anything. Yeah, this story really does just kind of push that whole narrative of, he's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Like, more than anything, you see him constantly dealing with, like, even the smaller things in life. And, just kind of being that guy who focuses on the smaller things, but also the big things, helping out the little guys out there. And I think that's what Spider-Man's all about, really, and I just, reading this story to me was like a flashback to my childhood. I thought it was amazing. Getting to see Spider-Man dealing with, different aspects of his life, like someone stalking MJ, or dealing with, like, Venom encounters and like different villains. It's really, you really get a feel for who Peter Parker is, not just Spider-Man but Peter Parker, and you get to see the challenges he faces in dealing with both those lives. You get to see a little bit of the struggles in their marriage, dealing with constantly being away from home and all that stuff. And I just thought that was super super cool, because I mean, I'm a big fan of just getting to know the character, not necessarily always looking at action-packed stories and stuff, but I always love to know like the psyche or what's going on with the character in their head when they're doing things, when they're being superheroes. What are they thinking? What's going through their head? And I think Spider-Man does that better than anyone, because like he's always talking to himself, thinking about, oh, what, I should improve from that. Oh, I should make an LED light notification so that I know when my web fluid's going to run out, because like I've been dealing with that issue for years now. Why haven't I thought of this? Like, it's really interesting getting to see that kind of like thought process of being a superhero in New York, and seeing what he encounters. And I gotta say, that's probably one of my favorite things about this book, aside from the really cool heroes. Now, one thing I wish I could have seen more of was Chameleon. They set up this really cool arc of like Chameleon like taking over like rich people's identities and like working his way up. He even at one point like replaced J. Jonah Jameson, but they never really concluded it, and I'm pretty sure that's because it got concluded in one of his spin-offs, so like Spectacular Spider-Man or Web of Spider-Man, which is unfortunate because I'm not sure those are collected in Omni format, and I'd really like to read those. It's funny because I always talk about how my first comic book was a Dark Knight's Metal event single issue, and while that's technically true, it's also in some ways not, because when I was a kid, I used to go to an ice cream parlor down by a beach in my neighborhood, and this nice old lady who ran the ice cream parlor / variety store also had comics for sale, like really old-fashioned comics, and I think this was probably 2005, 2008, and I bought some comics there for like really cheap, probably the value that they were at when they first came out, like $1.25, and I think I got 3 of them. One of them was a Death of Vermin issue. One of them was the Child Within. And another one was just a Web of Spider-Man issue with like the Vulture flying above him. And I mean, technically, those were my first comics. I've never read those. They are still in their bagged and board, condition. I've never opened them. They're still back in my hometown. Those were technically my first comics. I never really read them though. And I think really just kind of going back to the roots of what got me into superheroes, like if you looked at my toy bin as a kid, it was all like Spider-Man, Iron Man, all that stuff. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of DC. I've been super into DC, as you can tell by my background. You got the Flash, Green Lantern, Batman. But I'm really digging this Spider-Man stuff, and I think I'm going to get more into it, so you can expect more reviews regarding Spider-Man content coming up, because it was just a nice blast from the past, basically. But ultimately, this run was absolutely amazing. I'm super excited to read the next run with Eric Larson taking over from, McFarlane. So, yeah, hopefully I can get that Omni done sooner than later so I can give you guys a solid review. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, so that way you see all my other uploads. And if you have any recommendations for future uploads, leave a comment. Tell me what you want to see, because I'm more than open to take recommendations and start reading based off of those. Or if there's any runs that you'd recommend, let me know and I'll look into them. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.